Okay, students, here we are in the 1980s, week 31. This should be a shorter video today. All right, we had Jimmy Carter was the president, and at his time, there was an energy crisis. And when people were complaining about it was cold and it was expensive to heat the homes and this kind of stuff, he gave a speech saying, why don't you just wear a sweater? All right, and the pumps were closed and the gas was expensive and it was not good. It was a crisis called the energy crisis. So things were not looking good for him at the end of his term. Remember, we had the Iran hostage crisis also taking place, and he had done all of those various, he tried a rescue mission. I mentioned last week this idea of Argo. So I looked that up to be sure I knew what I was talking about. And it was a secret mission, but it was really carried out by our Canadian neighbors here. And what happened was there were 4 people who, the day that the American embassy was taken over, they weren't in it. And so when they found out it was taken over, they certainly didn't go back, and they went and hid in the Canadian embassy, and nobody knew they were there. And especially the Iranians at this point. And so there was this plot hatched by the guy who Ben Affleck plays in here. I can't remember his name right now. I think he was an American. And he went to the Canadians. He said, if we go in pretending to be Canadians and we're making a movie, they pretend to be making a movie, we can get those guys out of there. They had to get the Canadian government to agree to make those 4 Americans passports for Canada. And they did it. All right, so the movie Argo is apparently really good, but they don't give the Canadians enough credit, is my understanding. But that's what that was about. I mentioned it last week. I wanted to bring it up this week. All right, so it's 1980. We're going to see Carter up for re-election, and he's going to be up against Ronald Reagan. So Reagan, if you recall last time, the Republicans had considered him earlier when they put Ford in as their nominee. He had given this really powerful speech at the big meeting, what's that called? The Republican, all right, I got it. At the convention. So he was actually very popular, very conservative. He had been the governor of California. And when the election was held, here we go, 1980, you can see he won pretty handily. Check out that electoral vote, y'all. Yikes. And the thing that Reagan had was he had a certain amount of optimism. And he said here, you can tell a lot about a fellow's character by his way of eating jelly beans. So he's president number 40. I would have had some Jelly Belly. He loved Jelly Belly beans because they have great flavor. And I would have brought some of these for you today. He had been an actor, mostly B movies. He had been in a couple of pretty good movies. Newt Rockney, All American's a very good movie. He plays a football player. He was also in some stinkers like Bedtime for Bonzo and this kind of thing. But he was, a handsome guy. He was in charge of the Screen Actors Guild out there. He had been governor of California. But he was a real sunny, optimistic guy, and people liked that optimism. Here he is as governor of California with his wife Nancy there, and he did a good job as far as I know there. All right. His promise to the people was to get us out of this thing called stagflation that Carter had brought us into, where he had high taxes, high inflation, this kind of thing. Things were just not going anywhere. And so he said, if we lower the taxes, jobs and wages will go up. That was the simple idea about this thing called Reaganomics, or Reagan's economics. Some people called it trickle-down theory. During his presidency, we had the explosion of Mount St. Helens. This is in Washington State. So this was in 1980, I think. It could have been 81. He was president already, so maybe it was 81. And what happened was Mount St. Helens is not a mountain, it's a volcano. And if you've ever had me for science class, you've heard about this. Here it is. It's going to blow its top. There it is. So there it is. Before it blows its top, here it is afterwards. I want you to notice the foreground. Look at all those trees. Look at that forest. There's a beautiful lake down there called Spirit Lake. Gone, right? Because the blast was so intense. It just knocked everything down. It created petrified wood in a matter of weeks. It created a new canyon in a matter of days. So the geological immensity of this was very educational. We've learned a lot from this. The volcano is still active. It's starting to grow a new cone on the middle and the inside of it now, and it's still smoking and stuff like this. This shows you here how it happened. So here it is. Oh, it is 1980, May of 1980. All right, so So we see here the dome right here, and then it starts to landslide, and then it blows out of the top right here. So the ash that was sent out this very fine, powder. I remember I was a senior in high school at this time, and I remember it got, like it was cloudy outside, but it wasn't. It was just dust in the sky. We got it all down where we live down here. In 1980, there were the Winter Olympics in America in Lake Placid, New York. And typically when a country sponsors the Olympics, they tend to do pretty well for whatever reason. And our guys did well, namely the hockey team. They called it the Miracle on Ice, where the U.S. Hockey players, who were all a bunch of amateurs, played the Russians for the gold medal, and the Russians were unbeatable. I mean, they were absolutely, they were communists. The guys were, professionals and all this kind of stuff. And there's no way that we should have beat them. If you get a chance to go watch like a documentary on this, it's really quite exciting. And furthermore, there was a movie made about it, and I think the movie was just called Miracle, I think. And it talks about how that happened. Pretty exciting stuff. There they are with a gold medal. Nice. Early in his presidency, like 3 months into his presidency, there was an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan as he was walking into a meeting or a speech that he was going to give right here. A mad, crazed guy was in the audience back here, and he just pulled a gun out and shot toward him. He actually ended up shooting this man, and this guy got shot as well. But the president, at first we thought he was okay. They pushed him into his car right here. And we found out later he actually had been shot. Okay, so a bullet went actually through the door, apparently, through the crack of the door into his chest right here. And so they took him to the hospital. Here he is recuperating. He had to go into surgery to have the bullet removed. And during that time, the vice president would have been in charge. Okay, so that's kind of one of those things. Everybody's going, well, who's in charge of the country? He ended up doing really well with his recovery. He was so optimistic and so, sunny about it all that everybody thought, oh, wow, what a great guy. Here he is smiling and everything. So it made him even more endearing to the people of America. He was the first president to put a female on the Supreme Court, this woman, Sandra Day O'Connor. And she served for quite a long time on there. I think he was pretty proud of that. There was some bad news as well. In 1983, we had an embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, where that was where Americans were, but we had barracks where our army guys were staying. And what happened at this time was a Lebanese terrorist drove a truck really close, and I think he actually got into the fence. Somehow there was some sort of breach of security, got into the fence, and he exploded his truck, and it killed quite a few of our soldiers. 100 and something soldiers. It was terrible. So we see that Reagan's going to make a famous speech calling the USSR the evil empire. So we have the communists on one side, and then in Beirut we had the Muslim terrorists that were going on. So we had some Muslim, terrorism already at that point in time. All right, so here is the hammer and sickle showing the communist, tools, if you will. And of course, it's still very icy. So we're still very much in the Cold War here, and he wants to do something about this. So he said the only way to deal with the communists is to be strong. So we can have peace, but it has to be through strength, not giving up stuff, but beefing up stuff. Okay, so not stopping making weaponry like Nixon had, but increasing weaponry. There is no security, no safety in the appeasement of evil. He said, I will not appease them, I will defeat them. And so he came up with the idea of something known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known, sort of derogatory, as Star Wars. And the idea was to put some weapons in space. Remember, NASA was not supposed to be used for weapons, but put some weaponry as defensive systems. So if the Russians send up a missile, is this the Russians over here? Yeah. We could have something in space shoot it down before it got to us. Okay, so it would have been really, really expensive, but doable according to what I've heard. So at this time in Russia, something important happened. They got a new leader. Now this guy is the second in command. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. And he was very influential in the country in instituting new governmental procedures. And two of those were called glasnost and perestroika. And that was a softening of the communism. The economy over there was terrible. Okay, so everybody talks about how communism, is just building up, making everyone equal. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's terrible. Nobody does well in communism. Okay, so the idea that communism brings us all to the same level, well, that's true, all to the same low level. Yeah, so nobody's doing well. And so he started to relax that a little bit to say, okay, what we're going to do is going to allow a little more investment in companies and a little more, capitalistic ideas going on. And as soon as the people of Russia got just a simple little taste of that, they wanted more. And so it basically took on a life of its own, and we're going to see it's kind of going to bring down that communist government right there. Here's Reagan meeting with Gorbachev, and they apparently got along really well, although Reagan was very, very strong with them. Like at one point they were in Reykjavik, Iceland, and when Gorbachev would not even agree to a simple thing that they had previously agreed to, Reagan walked out. He just walked out and said, nope, I'm not going to negotiate with someone who doesn't keep their word. So he was very serious with them that way. So we see communism in the world. Everything that's red is communist. So we see obviously Russia. Look at Cuba right there, and a couple spots there in Africa. All right, and so Reagan is going to, of course, want to put an end to that. So remember that we have Berlin. So the Berlin Wall. So this is the whole of Germany right here. So West Germany, East Germany, and Berlin is right in the middle. This was that airlift that was going in there. And then we have Berlin and the Berlin Wall right here, which had been kind of that failure for JFK. And now Reagan's going to come in there, and we're going to see what he says. This is how it looked in 1983. So the wall was built up. Here's the east side, so everything very bleak over here. And then on the west side, there was lots of art painted on the wall like this. Yeah. So they had painted this on the west side. So that's what it looked like. And then we're going to see a speech made by the president. Famous.
Today I say, as long as this gate is closed, as long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind. In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
All right, it was a great speech. It was the tear down this wall speech. And so he was laying down the gauntlet there, and he said, come on, man, this is the way it's going to work. Space race still continued. Okay, so the space shuttle program was put into place during Reagan's administration. And Nixon had kind of set it up to be this, instead of traveling back to the moon, would be to fly around the Earth in an effort to maybe go farther someday. And now Reagan is continuing that. Okay, so they came up with what's known as the space shuttle. So the shuttle was a pretty cool deal where they would send up this shuttle and it would come back. And furthermore, they would actually recover all these parts too. So this is the big fuel tank right here. And it would, fuel the rocket for leaving. And you see, so it's the rocket right here. And all of these parts would land in the ocean. They would go retrieve them and reuse them. So a little bit of recycle programming going on there. And furthermore, this thing would land, right? It would be like a giant glider coming in to land, okay? We would send astronauts up into space into orbit. They wouldn't go any farther than orbit, however, and they would do different experiments and things in space. So here's how it happens, right? So they take off, they drop off these rockets, they drop off this fuel rocket right here, and then it goes up and it's in space. It's in orbit operations. Then when it comes down, upside down like this, re-entry, and then it lands with a big parachute right there, because it really didn't have any engines for that. It had a small amount of fuel in there for just moving around slightly to get into the proper orbit. We had several. We had Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. These were the different shuttles that went up. And this is a sad chapter in this history right here. The Challenger in 1986, we can see our astronaut crew right here. And this particular one, Reagan had made it a policy of his. He said, what I really want to do is I want to start exploring the idea of putting civilians up in space. And so he wanted to pick somebody that could go up into space who wasn't a professional astronaut. And he thought what would be the best example of someone doing that would be a teacher. And so he put out, and everybody, teachers from all over the country put in their application. And this is the woman right here who won it. Her name is Krista McAuliffe. So she was a school teacher, and she became part of the Challenger mission. All right, on the day of launch, it was in January. It was a very cold day. This proved to be the biggest problem right there, and we'll see what happens.
9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel cells. 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
Challenger, go and throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
So, yeah, it exploded. So they think what happened was that the O-rings in, those are just some rings that are like little washer things, were frozen, and that's what, and they would fix it. But her parents were, Krista McAuliffe's parents were watching, right there. They were sitting right there. All of her students back at home were watching this live when it went on, and it was just awful. So Reagan came. Oops, that's not what here we go. Reagan came to give a speech, several days, maybe a week later or whatever, and it was, I'm not saying it wasn't sad for the astronauts who perished in there. Of course it's sad. It's horrible. But the school teacher was, she wasn't trained for that. And so therefore these guys, they knew every time they went up it would be dangerous. Now, she did know it was dangerous. Don't get me wrong. They didn't tell her it was like a walk in the park or anything like that. And she took that. She wanted to do that. So I know that about her. She was very brave that way. But Reagan came and gave a speech. He said, "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." All right, that had been a quote from a poem by a World War II fighter pilot type of thing. Okay, so that was a tragedy for our nation. Meanwhile, we have a scandal now that's going to take place. for the Reagan administration. It's a little bit hard to understand, but the idea here is that in the effort of containment, of keeping communists out, especially of the New World, we knew there were communists in Cuba. Well, there was a communist government who had taken over in Nicaragua. And so it was part of Reagan's foreign policy. He stated in his elections that he wanted to do away with communism, that communism was the great evil in the world, the evil empire. And so one of the things he wanted to do was support groups that were anti-communist. So there were a group of people called the Sandinistas who were running Nicaragua. They were the communists. And there were people who were against the Sandinistas known as the Contras. So Contra means against. And so the idea was he wanted to support these Contras in their effort to take the country back over. But the Congress passed a law saying you could not give funds to these anti-communist groups. They did that just because they hated Ronald Reagan and they didn't want him to be able to do that. And so there was a scheme that was thought up by some people, and this guy was part of it. His name is Colonel Oliver North, and here he is giving testimony as to what happened. He's still around now, and he gives great stories about war stories and things like this. So basically what happened here is that since we couldn't help the Contras directly, we thought what we could do is we could help them indirectly. If we sold some weapons to Iran, who were not our friend, by the way, and the profits for that, we overpriced it, those profits would then go and be sent to the Contras. So it was sort of a scheme to go around that law that had been passed by the American Congress. Here's another schematic that talks about it. So this is interesting. So the CIA came up with this. They had surplus weapons, and they want to send them to Israel. And then Israel would then ship them to Iran, who was a dreaded enemy of them. And then Iran would, the money from that high price right there, so somehow the Israel was a middleman, would go to support the Contras in Nicaragua. Okay, so that turned in, somebody found out about it, and it turned into a big controversy. And Oliver North was called to testify. Now, when they wanted him to testify, he said, "I will only testify if you give me immunity." And that means he can't be held responsible for anything. So he came and he told them, they didn't know what he was going to say, but he essentially defended Ronald Reagan. And so Reagan was never really, he was never really thought of as the mastermind behind it. Sort of one of those things that y'all take care of that, and then they did that. And so a couple people did go to jail, but not Oliver North. All right, another election in there was an election in 1984. So 1980 was Reagan's election, and then in 1984 he won re-election, okay? And so his second term. And now his vice president is going to run in 1988, and look at here, he's going to win pretty good. He was up against this guy named Michael Dukakis, who was really just not a very good campaigner. George Bush was fairly popular. He vowed that he would continue in Ronald Reagan's same vein. He would continue with the same type of governing that Reagan had right there. So he becomes president number 41. And we'll talk more about him next week. Okay, we'll get into him, the rest of the end of the 1980s and the 1990s, and we'll finish up with that. Okay. All right, so I haven't really mentioned anything about the movies for a while, and that's probably because I'm not a big fan of the movies after the 1940s. So the 1950s movies, like I said previously when we talked about how everybody was getting a television set, right? So everybody had a TV, and because of that, the movies had to do stuff to compete with television, right? Even though televisions were small screens and black and white, all that kind of stuff, people needed a reason to come to the movies. So they started making them bigger and, more colorful and splashier and longer. A lot of them were very long. If you've ever gone to see the movie that has the intermission in the middle, and you got to wait, for it to end because they just got too long, in my opinion. So we're seeing a couple of them here. This is a really good one. It's called Sunset Boulevard. This is Some Like It Hot, which is hilarious. That's Marilyn Monroe. That was in black and white. This also in black and white. Some sci-fi movies. This was The Day the Earth Stood Still. And this guy, iconic guy, he only made 3 movies. His name is James Dean. So he was making those 3 movies in the 1950s. For me, I will say, here is probably the greatest musical ever made in 1950. And that's Gene Kelly dancing to Singing in the Rain. And it's interesting because what it is it's telling the story of something that happened in the past about when Hollywood had silent movies moving over to movies with sound. But it's very, very good. I recommend it. And this is Cary Grant in North by Northwest. It's Alfred Hitchcock. It's a mystery. He's being chased by this plane. It's kind of big and splashy and a little too long, but very good. I like that one. All right, the 60s and 70s, in my opinion, even worse. Yeah, so there were some good ones, obviously, but nothing like the glory days of the studio system. The studio system is no longer active at this point, so there are independent studios, independent actors, stuff like that. This one is a good one, 1961. It's called To Kill a Mockingbird. We mentioned this earlier when we talked about the book that came out, written by Harper Lee. And the book was a very good adaptation of the book. The movie was a good adaptation of the book, even though it didn't cover every single bit of it. It covered the main things, and it's just very good. Here we have Scout with her dad Atticus on the porch, figuring out life, right? This, of course, 1965, another one of my favorites, one of the optimistic ones. Once again, hearkening back to an earlier time in history. This is The Sound of Music. Back in Germany during the beginning of World War II. In the 70s, we have some kind of creepy, scary ones like Jaws in 1976. And, of course, Star Wars, probably the most iconic of the time, and it came out in 1977. Okay, so I'm not saying that they're not good movies. I'm just saying they're different, okay? And some of them are a little darker than before. Okay, so y'all, that is it. That's all I have. See, a nice short lecture. I promised you one of these would be coming. Next week we'll talk a little bit about George Bush's administration and the war and everything in the Gulf War, and we'll finish up next week. Okay, y'all have a good week. Bye.